In 2010, Bungie had come out of its explosive decade to meet a very different gaming industry, one they influenced, regardless of intentions. While Halo Reach may not have shook the console gaming scene as the trilogy did, it positively impacted Halo's fans, Bungie's experience, and Microsoft's profits. Fans were left with the most modular game yet, Bungie fulfilled their contract, and Microsoft were left with a brand that, while no longer dominant, was reliable and respected. Detractors on forums attempted to pan the game for declining player numbers at a higher rate than Halo 3, but while Reach's gameplay alterations may have left some purists behind, Halo's diminishing population was ultimately inevitable. When a title is simply satisfying the people that love it instead of setting a new bar for the industry, only devout followers will remain. Everything unique to Halo, from its seamless on-foot to vehicle combat, to its open levels, to its rich science fiction world, was now being done elsewhere. While the innovations from Halos 1 to 3 were declining in their significance, they were still new mechanics and features never seen before on consoles, whereas ODST and Reach, while good games, began taking influence from other shooters on the market. But while Bungie worked on their goodbye present, Microsoft were already making plans for the future. .343 Industries was founded by Microsoft in 2009. While Bungie were getting ready to move out, Microsoft was attempting to assemble a dream team. Established developers were brought in from the likes of DICE, Rockstar, Pandemic, BioWare, id Software, Monolith, and many more. What began as a small core group of people in the planning stages quickly escalated into a fully fledged AAA development studio with one task: continuing Halo. Opportunities and decisions were endless. 343 Industries could have begun with side projects in the vein of ODST and Halo Wars, create expansions to Bungie's upcoming games, or comfortably build a new Halo experience for their publisher's next console. But Microsoft didn't see a studio that needed to be evolved or trained. They saw a team that needed to get their boots in the mud. Within the same year they were founded, 343 Industries had been tasked with creating a new trilogy for the Master Chief, starting with a sequel to Halo 3, Microsoft's best-selling, high-profile exclusive, and one of the most beloved games of all time. No pressure. Halo 3's tagline may have been "Finish the fight," but it wasn't "Finish the franchise," because the game's legendary ending left the universe with enough intrigue and mystery to warrant exploration. The Halo rings were disabled, the Flood were destroyed, and the Covenant failed their plans. None of these could be in the spotlight again, leaving the Forerunners. Early in development, three things were clear. Halo 4 is going to be a sequel to Halo 3, it would star the Master Chief, and the Forerunners would be the primary antagonist in both story and gameplay. Unfortunately, this vague setup is all the developers had to go on for far too long, to the point where it began to damage the studio's efficiency. What would become the Prometheans were originally slated to have 6 main enemies for the player to fight. Red flags should have flared immediately, because 6 enemy classes in one faction is something Bungie didn't aim for until their second game. Consequently, 3 enemy classes were cut before prototyping began, due to challenges with the Promethean Knights, the Forerunners' equivalent of the Elites. Having never worked alongside each other before, it was frequent for visual or mechanic designs to be iterated upon in isolation from one another, until it directly conflicted with the other or the fiction.
We rebuilt this character at least 3 times from the ground up during the production of Halo 4, because we weren't happy with it, with various different versions of it. And so what we found was, we would go down a path with mechanics and then discover, oh, well, now we've introduced a behavior that doesn't make sense with some of the established fiction. Or we would go down a path with visuals and we would say, oh, this is a cool looking character, but it doesn't support the gameplay needs that we have for this character mechanically. And so it wasn't until we became really clear about what the prioritization was of these different elements and who would lead that we were able to find success. In the end, we were really happy with the way that this character turned out, but Honestly, it was so painful, and we could have done a much, much better job of getting to the end point and done that a lot more effectively and efficiently.
I believe it to be likely that all of 343's time spent on the Knight distracted them from issues with the other two Forerunner classes, the Watchers and the Crawlers. Watchers were being prototyped alongside the Knights. However, what appeared to be early success led to their implementation not receiving enough investigation. When the developers realized the Watchers weren't dynamic enough in combat, it was too late, and the game would have to ship with them as is. Similar issues were had with the Crawlers, as they weren't able to be tested in the prototype phase. Understandably, the designers didn't want the Promethean's minion to be a robotic grunt, but what's seen in the final product led to issues that I'll discuss in gameplay. Why the game's story wasn't set in stone for such a long period is something that can only be speculated. But it more than likely has to do with the developers wanting to approach the story from the polar opposite angle of Bungie. Master Chief wasn't a silent protagonist, but he fell into the same category of player character as Gordon Freeman or Marathon Security Officer, a blank slate for the player to inhabit. Meanwhile, Halo's new developer felt that after being portrayed so much outside of the game's original trilogy as his own character, it should come full circle. But in order for Chief's personality to come through without being jarring, there needed to be a thematic reason for this change. We know now that the game's idea was to focus its story on Chief's AI companion Cortana, but based on what I've read, it took months for the team to commit to this narrative. Finally, while the game was built as a narrative follow-up to Halo 3, it was a real-world follow-up to Halo Reach. The development team tried to accomplish that game's goals of unifying the experience between single-player, multiplayer, and co-op, but from a new angle. Knowing that these ambitions would prevent development of some of Halo's staples, 343 Industries brought in the assistance of Certain Affinity, a co-developer that worked on everything from Halo 2 map packs to Call of Duty Black Ops. They were tasked with not only assisting in competitive multiplayer, but also Forge, which previously made a giant leap forward from Halo 3 to Reach. Halo 4's development may not have been chaos like Halos 1 and 2, but it's clear that Microsoft figured it could avoid the struggles met in creating a team from scratch by hiring experienced developers and throwing money at the project, and their hopes didn't come to pass. When Bungie were at the helm, they made an interesting choice with Halo 2, where the game was built to be more accessible, as can be seen with the greatly increased aim assist, yet the game sped up the pacing, making the gameplay more visceral and giving you less time to react. Halos 3 and Reach would back up on this and not only slow it down to make the game less chaotic, but also introducing easy-to-understand mechanics like equipment and armor abilities. Meanwhile, Halo 4's gone right back with the Halo 2 method. It's noticeable the instant upon playing, but in a good way. I hadn't talked about this previously as it would have gone repetitive over the course of 5 videos, but Halo games have varied in control. They've all felt great and only made minor tweaks in the movement and aiming, but each game has its own little quirks. Combat Evolved still holds up, but its movement, especially jumping, is very floaty and of its time. Halo 2 is the peak in how good the game felt to play, but its button glitches combined with wonky hitboxes made for some occasional frustration. Halo 3 didn't fix the latter, but certainly the former. Yet it also made further tweaks to the aim acceleration and narrowed the field of view, and it felt like a step backwards. Halo 4's only quirk I could find is that sprinting feels a bit like your character is running on a wet floor. Other than that, the movement and shooting is just as good, if not better, than Halo 2. Having spent more time on PC in 2012 than when Halo 3 and Reach came out, it spoke volumes when I didn't notice the usual downgrade in precision from mouse and keyboard to a gamepad. It's certainly there, I just didn't feel it. Whether it's two-shotting a jackal or sniping an enemy player, aiming and shooting hadn't felt this precise since Bungie's second outing. Something that compounds this feeling of visceral precision is the audio. Halo games were always notable for their sound design, and that's carried over to Bungie's latest title, Destiny. Weapons always feature a distinct and satisfying bite, but I'd never call them impactful. My favorites were always the Halo 2 battle rifle and the Halo 3 sniper rifle. But Bungie's approach to sound design is less about making guns have a realistic oomph or to rock your headphones. They're more about making a clear distinction between different classes of weapons. It doesn't matter if the plasma rifle sounds a little weak, as long as you can immediately identify it as a plasma rifle. But in wanting to make a distinction between Bungie's trilogy and 343's, every sound effect was made from scratch, and it, just like the precise controls, are immediately noticeable with the assault rifle. The booming sound design, precise controls, and faster pace all point towards the development team wanting to make Halo 4 more visceral and intense. And while all three of these are on target, they can't end some of the design issues that crop up. One of them, like the positives I mentioned, is immediately notable, but in a negative way, and that's the artificial intelligence. Money couldn't remedy the limitations made by outdated hardware, yet the grand expectation from people with each new game is that it would look noticeably better than the last, and concessions would have to be made. Halo Reach tuned its engine so that more AI could run on screen at once, along with higher detail. But as I previously described, in order to maintain game balance, the improved AI quantity led to levels being filled with cannon fodder enemies, which was boring and repetitive. Utilizing the same technology and engine as Bungie, 343 dialed back on the AI quantity and upped the detail, a welcome change. Unfortunately, the more sophisticated an AI is, the more resources it takes, and with a real lack of it, 343 sacrificed many of the AI's finer details. Halo Combat Evolved and Halo 2 had arguably some of the best AI in first-person shooters next to Half-Life and Fear. Not only was their inherent design thought out, but the AI could be trusted in making fights interesting, with elites in Halo 2 attempting to dodge your shots and suppress you from afar. Halo 3's brutes weren't as agile, but they still had interesting tactics on the battlefield, such as ordering everyone near them to throw a grenade at the player, and Reach maintained the elite's capabilities. These finer details are very much lacking in Halo 4. For reference, my playthroughs of every game has been done on Heroic, and I did 2 playthroughs for this video, and my suspicions were only confirmed with more playtime. It's understandable that the average player wouldn't be able to put their finger on this missing detail, but it's instrumental in why the Covenant didn't seem to be as dynamic in this game. It's unfortunate that classes such as drones and engineers aren't included here, but the Covenant enemies in Halo 4 were all that Combat Evolved needed, and it's not the reason why Halo 4's firefights, while enjoyable, don't feel as tense. This only puts more pressure on Halo 4's new enemies, the Prometheans. They're introduced by the 3rd level and in many ways work best in this introduction. You fight them in a handful of small arenas before they're mixed together with the Covenant, bringing back the best mechanic that ever came from CE's flood levels, where you divert one's attention while the other doesn't have you in their sights. But this is an exception to the rule. For the most part, arenas are either all Covenant or all Promethean, and because each conglomerate has 3 types of enemies that comprise of cannon fodder, support, and soldier, they don't feel as distinct as they should. But the Covenant are tried and true, and even with their downgraded AI, are still enjoyable to fight. The Covenant weapons they wield can affect their roles. A Jackal with a charged plasma pistol is different from one using a Needler. The Prometheans don't share this. A crawler rushing you with a suppressor isn't different from when they're using a bolt shot. Because the Knights wield a blade, it doesn't matter if they're carrying a light rifle or a scatter shot, they're still going to mess you up in close range either way. Their weapons don't alter their roles in combat, which are already very one-note. Crawlers may have the same role as a Grunt, but they're not nearly as dynamic. Grunts are cannon fodder, but they can wield different firearms, use stationary weapons, and operate vehicles. While their grenades rarely result in a player being killed, it's always a possibility, requiring attention, and since Halo 3, suicide grunts were another mechanic that forces the player to remain on alert. Crawlers don't throw grenades, can't fit into vehicles, or operate turrets, and they move too quickly for grenades to effectively kill them, meaning your only 2 options of elimination are shoot and melee. Watchers can protect Knights from incoming fire, throw back your grenades, and revive fallen allies. And because they fly around, you can't conveniently melee them, meaning the only thing you can do is shoot them. Knights use the full Halo sandbox, and are the best designed of all the Promethean enemies, but despite their strength and abilities, at range they're only bullet sponges, which is the best way to kill them due to their extremely high damage up close. Their ability to teleport may have been acceptable on paper, but it's not enjoyable to fight against. Shooting an enemy and having to wait 5 seconds to shoot them again doesn't challenge the player intellectually or mechanically. It only delays the inevitable. The Prometheans may be a stronger and more varied enemy than the Flood, but that's a very low standard. Saying the worst enemies in this game aren't as bad as the previous worst enemies isn't something that deserves praise. In knowledge of their mistakes during development, the designers added unique variants of existing enemies such as Knights with the binary rifle or incineration cannon, but too little too late doesn't quite do it justice. There's very little skill in eliminating them, since whether or not their high-powered weapons instantly kill you depends on if the AI lands their shots or not. The Covenant Fuel Rod was intentionally made to give the player a small chance to recover upon being hit, and the Energy Sword Elites or Gravity Hammer Brutes were entirely close range. The player's survival depended on how they controlled the battle. Knights with power weapons is Russian roulette, where an AI script is a revolving cylinder. I don't know when these Promethean weapons were conceived of, but I don't believe they were made with those that would be used upon in mind, because they're all satisfying to some degree to use when you're in control of them, but are frustrating to fight against. The distinction between UNSC and Covenant weapons was, originally, straightforward. Humans were hit-scan, aliens were projectiles. And while Halo 2 would go on to add the carbine and beam rifle, they were still made with players in mind, since they'd be fighting against them constantly. The Promethean weapons exist in this awkward realm between the two. Effectively, they're more specialized UNSC weapons, with 3 primary firearms that aren't as satisfying, and 2 power weapons that are almost overkill, and one of the most useless grenades in video game history. Perhaps the similarity to human-made weapons was a conscious choice, since the Prometheans used to be ancient humans, but it still doesn't excuse how little this arsenal changes an enemy's role in combat. The same can be said for armor abilities, a feature returning from the previous game but as an afterthought, especially in the campaign. There's more to talk about in multiplayer, but here you don't even really get to choose which ones to use. Reach's selection was hardly complex, but at least there was only one section where you had to use a specific ability. In Halo 4, missions give you an ability, and every once in a blue moon, you can pick up this hideously underpowered sentry. The game ends up using abilities the same way previous games used weapons. Instead of a free pistol when hunters arrive, you get a free thruster pack. Hologram jetpack and active camouflage all return, and while my issues with them from the previous video still apply, in the campaign, you barely use them. The levels themselves are an oddity. Halo 4 dropped Reach's ambitions of scale and gameplay to increase fidelity, but in visual design, the game makes you want to feel overwhelmed, a speck of a human despite being the Master Chief. That illusion is powerful and effective, but the levels themselves, where the player moves around, are the most linear since Halo 2, and just like Halo 2, the game occasionally opens up only to squish you down a path again. I'm not against linear levels, and the arenas support enough room for player expression. What's a much bigger problem is how badly the clone brush has reared its ugly head. This is an element that's steadily improved from Halos 1 through 3, so to see it brought back to the forefront is a disappointment, especially when some of these repetitive layouts feel ripped from previous games. The padding occasionally suffocates with the rule of threes and the Mammoth being the worst offenders. This vehicle is responsible for the campaign's halfway point being the weakest level in the game. Fitting, because it's also the story's greatest failing. Reach was the first Halo game to truly utilize a different cinematic style and thematic tone. Creative decisions influenced this, but truthfully it was because of the changing hands from Joseph Staten as writer and cinematic director to Lee Wilson. Atmosphere was altered with Bungie's more experimental titles like ODST and Reach, and those first steps became a leap in Halo 4. The opening is ominous and moody within moments, utilizing silence and camera movements to unease the player, and then relieves that tension with a familiar face and music sting. This range of emotion is Halo 4's greatest strength in the campaign, and it makes for an opening that sets the stage for what's to come. Except this isn't actually the opening of the game. This is.
Tell me about the children. Dr. Halsey.
In fact, it's rather amazing how the strengths and weaknesses of Halo 4's storytelling are identified by the contrast of these two scenes. Chief's Awakening has excellent cinematography, sound design, and most importantly, subtle expressions from Cortana. But the CG opening begins with an interrogation of Dr. Halsey, the main talent behind the Spartan program that created Master Chief. I'm not opposed to the scene's aspirations of highlighting Oni, the moral concerns over Halsey's program, and the Spartan's broken mind, but its overusage of flashbacks only muddies the water. Those new to the series only know the surface-level details of what's going on in this scene, and what took place before, and veterans like myself were thrown for a loop with the visuals. At first, the Spartan on screen is presumably Master Chief in the present due to his armor, but then it cuts to a Covenant invasion where Spartan 2s were fighting them off with said armor, informing that this is a flashback and the armor is just an art style change. Okay then, everything's fine. But then we cut to a single Spartan, who is perhaps the chief, followed up by a Spartan defeating a brute chieftain, which has to be the chief in a flashback around the time of Halo 3, but then it's followed by Halsey handing Chief Cortana. So now it's another flashback taking place after the first one, but before the last one.
What?
To make matters worse, it's not even clear that Halsey is younger in this scene. From the dark lighting, it appears they're using the same model, giving the possibility that some may think this is a flash forward instead of a flash back. Without a doubt, this scene should have been cut. For all its visual flair, it only confuses the player, even after back-to-back viewings. The ideas it presents are intriguing, but they ultimately have nothing to do with Halo 4's story. Halsey never appears, Oni has no involvement, and nothing about the Chief's backstory is explored. Remove the dialogue about Chief missing in action, and I'd be convinced it's for a different Halo game. Truthfully, Halo 4 is telling two stories. The quality ranges from best in the series' history to complete by the numbers pulp. Halo 4's weak link in its story, despite all the time spent, are the Forerunners. The game's sense of mystery, discovery, and scale are illustrated with a beautiful atmosphere laced with unceasing tension. But when having to confront larger ideas, the storytelling abandons subtlety and intelligence to robotically inform you of its concepts. When this level's joyride mercifully ends, you're treated to a textbook example of a deus ex machina. Without this scene taking place right at the game's halfway mark, you wouldn't know the antagonist's goals, the backstory of your enemies, a doomsday device built to reduce you to particles, that the librarian is a protector of humanity who's able to alter genes to imprint subconscious instructions that led to the creation of Chief's armor and Smart's AIs, and that she has the power to render Chief immune to said doomsday device. That's a lot to weigh on a character's introduction. The librarian's name is only mentioned a single time before this scene, and it happens to be when the game's primary antagonist has just been revealed. The composer isn't mentioned at all in the game's script until this point. This crucial information is available, but in the game's laughably inconvenient terminals. In my research, I couldn't dig up anything about deleted levels or story alterations, but these point-blank exposition dumps exist only to artificially move the plot forward. A task it ultimately fails due to how often this scene flew right over players' heads. It's not because it's complicated, it's just poorly told. At the end of this scene, the librarian says that the genes she placed within you contain many gifts, one of which is immunity to the composer. But despite being told this, and witnessing Chief be brought to his knees by this acceleration, there is zero effect on gameplay, creating an unavoidable disconnect between the player and their character. Even Chief confusingly avoids informing Cortana what the librarian did to him.
Chief, what happened? Your bio readings are all over the map.
It's a long story, but I know what the Didact's after.
I know that part. The librarian filled me in when she snatched me from the system. But what I don't know is what she did to you.
It's really rather baffling how contrived this moment is, because something Halo 4 greatly elevates is its emotional range and subtlety in voice acting and motion capture. To conclude discussion of this level, despite its inarguable low point in gameplay and storytelling, it has one of my favorite moments.
They don't care about you! They replaced you!
Blast it!
It's okay.
How? How is this okay? How is putting you at risk because I can't hold it together okay? Chief, do you even understand what rampancy is? Really? We don't just shut down. Our cognitive processes begin dividing exponentially according to our total knowledge base. We literally think ourselves to death.
You know I won't let that happen.
And if it happens anyway?
Lasky.
Go, Commander.
This exchange demonstrates the two reasons why the plot involving Cortana's rampancy is far more compelling than Earth's peril. Unlike the game's Forerunner plotline, this story isn't one note. The emotional depth of its characters can be seen not just over the course of the game, but sometimes within the opening of a mission. Cortana's rampancy is hinted at in the prologue, but it's fully introduced after Chief lands on the mysterious Forerunner planet. The mission begins with news that your partner in crime for 3 games is going to die. On this low note, the mission then leads you down to witness a grand reveal, inspiring awe the same way CE's second mission did. And after driving a warthog enriched with nostalgia and an uplifting atmosphere, Cortana says this.
Chief? About my condition? I didn't want to mention it, seeing as how it's a complete long shot, but since you brought it up, it is possible that getting home could help me find a solution for my rampancy.
That emotional pacing is what's been missing from previous Halo games, and it's easily Halo 4's greatest addition. For once, Jen Taylor and Steve Downes truly shine in their roles. It's expressed through subtle inflections and face capture that Cortana is still who she used to be, and fights to maintain her likable, sassy persona while facing mortality. Meanwhile, Chief is having to be the voice of reason while making his own decisions. And a large reason why these vignettes work is, as always, the music. Marty O'Donnell and Michael Salvatore moved on to Destiny, so 343 needed a new composer and selected Neil Davidge from Massive Attack and Kazuma Junichi, who, along with Halo 4's sound designer, worked on Metal Gear Solid. Understanding that Marty and Michael's music simply couldn't be matched or imitated, as proven by Halo Anniversary's lack of response, Neil made the smart move and focused on contributing his own sound. Halo 4's soundtrack isn't as memorable, but every track adds to the experience, and when it's at its peak, create a brilliant atmosphere not previously felt. The reveal of Requiem is arguably the game's best track. When the music and storytelling are at their best, Halo 4 manages to communicate a sense of dread and hopelessness not felt since Combat Evolved's Flood reveal, and it's done by feeding the player a little trinket of hope before they receive a metaphorical kick in the teeth. When the composer is being taken by the didact, Cortana's rampancy and Neil's score says that all is lost.
What's he doing? Cortana, see if you can raise Tilson. Get me a status on the rest of the station.
I can't believe you did that.
Until Chief manages to bring Cortana back to the situation, with plans to get yourself and everyone else off the station, and then it makes you witness everyone's death. It may sound counterintuitive, but a large reason why the scene after it works so well is the restraint from Neil and the sound designers to not score it, and instead let silence enhance the drama. It's a shame that gameplay-wise, the final level isn't firing on all cylinders. Had there been a more interesting final battle than the same 3 platforms on repeat, it might have been the strongest final act in the series. Ever since Combat Evolved's Warthog run, designers couldn't figure out how to match its excitement, and unfortunately Halo 4 doesn't change that. Oddly enough, I'm okay with Chief climbing the elevator and crawling toward a nuclear bomb to be a QuickTime event, as it would have been more abrupt to cut to a cinematic, but pressing a button to kill one enemy is unnecessary and unsatisfying. I prefer it to Halo 2's lame boss fight and Halo 3's awkward battle with Guilty Spark, but only because those alternatives stretch the immediate drama for too long, not because this is good. But if anything, Diadac's lame death only confirms that despite the game ostensibly being about saving Earth, it's clear the focus was on Chief's personal stakes rather than those of humanity. Halo 4's ending isn't as gut-wrenching as the likes of Spec Ops: The Line, Telltale's Walking Dead, or MGS3, but it's easily the most emotionally impactful scene in the franchise. I adore the subtlety in Chief's delivery, trying to maintain his usual demeanor and failing to do so, while Cortana's final lines are perfectly timed with the music and visuals.
Wait. Welcome home, John.
The final cinematic with Chief left drifting in space, followed by his conversation with the side character Lasky, leaves the game in a place the series hadn't been before, with a hero emotionally damaged and a beloved character only left to be remembered, and never to return. Right? But it's not actually the ending, because just like Reach, it has to ram in a final monologue out of the blue, despite establishing none throughout the rest of the campaign. God damn it. Halo 4's campaign is the shortest yet, leaving to question why it has easily the largest number of copy-paste arenas since Combat Evolved, while also featuring the most linear levels since Halo 2. In fact, one of Halo 4's biggest problems is that it echoes so much of Bungie's designs, it seems 343 also carried over Bungie's mistakes along with them, like Suicide Grunt corridors, Forerunner clone brushing, and anticlimactic bosses. But that's just it. Most of my gameplay issues with Halo 4 already existed previously, and while it's a shame 343 didn't use their first game to remedy these errors, it's at least understandable. And just like the original trilogy, it has those moments that fully engage, and in some aspects, mainly in storytelling, done in ways that hadn't been previously achieved. In the making of all my videos, revisiting multiplayer hasn't been much of a challenge. The Master Chief Collection brought back the online components for most of the games, Reach has backwards compatibility, and its unique invasion mode still has enough players to get a game going. But Halo 4's multiplayer fundamentally changed over its lifespan, making for a game that today plays very differently than what originally came in November 2012. Halo 4 shares Reach's goal of trying to unify campaign, multiplayer, and co-op. But whereas Reach attempted this through the environment, Halo 4 tackled it with lore. It was a decision that avoided Bungie's mistake of creating environments that had to cater to 3 modes of play, instead of making the most of its mechanics. However, while this connection doesn't take away from the experience, it doesn't really contribute. Informing campaign lovers that multiplayer is now war games, a simulated battleground where Spartan Force can compete against one another, doesn't really address what made them previously ignore multiplayer. And it makes even less sense when applied to the opposite. If someone has never cared about Halo's campaigns, why would telling them that multiplayer takes place in the campaign's universe make them want to jump into it? It's an ambitious goal, but it ultimately doesn't assist either fan. In the last video, I talked about how Halo Reach expanded on Halo 3's social ranking, and altered its ranking system to highlight experience across all playlists, with the exception of Arena. That system had many problems and led to matchmaking issues for new and experienced players. But Halo 4 doesn't fix these issues, and instead expands on Reach's flawed system even further, with experience not only granting you cosmetic options, but alterations that directly affect gameplay. Cosmetic unlocks are more abundant than ever, and loadouts have been expanded from pre-configured arsenals to personalized configurations utilized in a majority of playlists. For many, this is Halo 4's worst edition, and while I disagree, that frustration is understandable, as the system has a plethora of issues in both progression and gameplay. The reason so many people have an attachment to Halo 2 and Halo 3's skill-based ranking system is because their playstyle greatly evolved over time, and even if you didn't ultimately get to level 50, it was still satisfying, because whether you went from 1 to 45 or 1 to 20, you still felt yourself steadily improving. But each game after swiftly abandoned it, and replaced it with the feeling of having more stuff. But unlike other games that have used this system, Halo 4's stuff doesn't want to conflict with the moment-to-moment gameplay. None of your primaries are stronger than power weapons, armor abilities have been dialed back, and you can only select from 3 secondary weapons. A great example of seemingly large additions with lackluster effects are the armor mods, often being compared to Call of Duty's perk system. Thing is, if you look at Call of Duty's perks, they have a far greater range of application than armor mods. I know when someone's using Flak Jacket, Lightweight, or Steady Aim. The same can't be said for Awareness, Gunner, or Nemesis. It seems that the developers were terrified of creating armor mods that altered gameplay too much, and in doing so created bonuses that are so minor or situational they're next to useless. And in making the majority of them underpowered, led to a handful of loadouts that were helpful, and obvious choices to be made, and many inherent design conflictions. Why is the worst primary weapon unlocked last, especially when the most overpowered was the first? Why is a shotgun pistol or a noob combo selectable? Who uses pulse grenades? If the game's point system is to encourage team play, why is the most selfish armor ability your first unlock, and the most beneficial to your team the last? Why is picking up enemy grenades a mod? Why do higher level players get to unlock ordnance faster than those starting out? Speaking of which, I believe ordnance damages the game far more than loadouts. I've been playing Halo for a long time, so what the enemy starts off with doesn't impact me too much. Except for the bolt shot, you can literally turn around entire matches with this thing. But loadouts aren't randomized, whereas ordnance is. It completely transforms the dynamic of combat and map control, as controlling a sector isn't about the weapons it may have or the power-ups that spawn from it, but instead how the environment lets you use your reward. Players on the receiving end of a powerful ordnance drop can't strategize against it, they can only focus fire and hope for the best. Most baffling of all is that because items are randomized, they're often not even satisfying for the person that gets them. When your ordnance drop grants you a needler and someone else's contains a binary rifle, it's hard to conjure up the benefit of this system. The final nail in the coffin is that it was made to give new players more opportunities to use power weapons, but new players were often confused by Halo 4's new scoring system. Instead of kills, the game now tracks points, and this is a welcome change. But the points you earn contribute to your ordnance, not the game's score, making for an unintuitive interface. And the confusion only continues, because personal ordnance was only available in a handful of modes. Odd considering there's a whole armor mod dedicated to earning it faster. But world ordnance were random weapon drops that would spawn in a map every 2 minutes in a different location, and these were in nearly every game type at launch. This is why I believe ordnance is the larger issue with Halo 4's multiplayer than loadouts. Loadouts are a mixture of bonuses that don't assist your opponent much and weapons you can at least predict, whereas ordnance reduces fights to a coin toss. And while this may have been okay for one playlist, it was too widespread for its own good. But something you'll notice when playing the game today is that these issues, mainly ordnance drops, aren't very prevalent outside of Infinity Slayer. In fact, when playing Master Chief Collection, you don't run into it at all, and the DMR is no longer overpowered. The AR, BR, and light rifle are completely viable options. So, what happened? Well, over its lifespan, with a quickly decreasing player base, the 443 Industries released a series of patches to address many of the game's problems, mainly in terms of weapon balance and game modes, bringing back the 4-shot battle rifle and the 2-shot beatdown from Halo 3, increasing the movement speed, buffing weapons, and replacing many game types previously featuring random ordnance drops with classic fixed weapons respawning every 2 minutes. And technically brought back skill-based rankings, but unknown to many players due to not showing it in-game and using Waypoint instead. And now to finally discuss Halo 4's multiplayer gameplay. Unfortunately, I won't be able to cover Spartan Ops, Dominion, or Ricochet. I can't judge Spartan Ops fairly, as it can't be balanced for single player. I remember enjoying Dominion, but wasn't able to accurately break it down for this video. This wouldn't be a big deal if Invasion hadn't gone from a mode I previously thought was only okay to my favorite part of Halo Reach 6 years later. It's only fair that Dominion should be covered if I could have replayed it the same way I did with Invasion. This applies to Ricochet as well. I remember loving this mode to death, but it was only a temporary playlist, and I didn't see it while capturing. Halo 4's visceral combat combined with its punchy sound design makes for a multiplayer component that's a lot faster and harder hitting than the last few games. Getting someone with a shotgun blaster decking them right in the visor is even more satisfying than in the campaign. It's easily the fastest game since Halo 2 or Halo 3's MLG variants, and while armor abilities are carried over from previous games, there aren't any that slow down the pace of combat. Jetpacks, camo, and hologram return with the same issues as before, but due to how fast you move and the intelligent map design, they aren't as much of a nuisance. Armor lock's been replaced with Hardlight Shield that no one uses, and the Regen Shield has been replaced with the Regen Field. But that's just it. The armor abilities have been dialed back to the point where they don't feel like they're actively contributing to the Halo sandbox. The most ever gotten out of them are in party games like Rock and Rail or Infection. It's the third game to attempt a fourth pillar in the Halo sandbox, and while this attempt has been an improvement over Reach, it's not because the system is good, it's because it isn't as damaging to the game's pacing. I originally said that Halo 3's equipment was the weakest iteration, but after replaying Reach and 4, I take it back. Armor abilities aren't better or worse, they're just different. And like equipment, I don't miss them when they're gone, mainly because maps play just fine without them. Halo 4's map selection is a definite improvement over Halo Reach, but it doesn't quite meet Halo 3 and nowhere near Halo 2's unmatched collection. While none of the levels suffer from abysmal choke points, the designs are really safe. Abandoned and Complex were the only asymmetrical maps at launch, making all of the other maps blend into one another by memory despite their quality. Halo 4 is a great example of ostensibly minor alterations resulting in a very different gameplay experience. The biggest examples are Sprint and Flinching. The former was an ability in the last game and typically overruled everything else in the match. Now on the one hand, Sprint frustrated hardcore fans who felt it removed the importance of positioning and strategy, while on the other, it took Halo a decade until soldiers in the middle of a gunfight had the option to run. Halo 4 went in the direction of the latter, and considering that the developers openly said they wanted to appeal to as many audiences as possible while satisfying longtime fans, it isn't much of a surprise that what was, in many people's eyes, a simple and logical addition was implemented. But granting the player with effectively 2 movement speeds impacts everything from map design, weapon locations, animations, and strategy. As someone who's admittedly a cheeky player,
wow, how many bullets can I put into you?
Sprint and the lack of consequences for using it in this game are severe enough to make me pause. Not for very long, but, you know, it's something. I mentioned that despite Armor Lock and Sprint being the polar opposite of each other on the surface, they actually serve the same greater purpose of allowing the player to possibly avoid punishment for being in a bad position. Halo 4's solution with the former is to have the game's Hardlight Shield prevent your energy shields from recharging. Makes sense. But sprinting never received a negative of this caliber. In fact, the only negative for sprinting everywhere is the brief moment when your weapon isn't on target. You do slow down while sprinting if you're hit with no shields, but if the player's option is to stand and die or sprint and possibly live, then they've only got one true option. It's a feature that both adds and takes away from the game. I enjoy the increased speed, but Halo 2 accomplished the same sense of pace without it. Flinching, aka the removal of descoping, is another superficially teeny alteration with greater consequences. Long-range battles in Halo had previously featured quick decisions for the player to make, whether or not to go for accurate shots, or to suppress the enemy and prevent them from zooming in, or to simply flee. It's far from complex, but there's an inherent tension and potential for multiple outcomes. Even when one player's shields have been drained, they can still come back. Those reversals don't occur nearly as often in Halo 4 due to when being shot while zooming in, you flinch instead of descope. But not only is the effect rarely enough to give someone the chance of a comeback, it makes primary rifles effectively power weapons on large maps. And speaking of power weapons, sniper rifles are easier than ever. Suppression is no longer possible as it's far too easy to hide behind a wall and adjust for the occasional hit. There's even an armor mod to make it easier. It's a design that negatively affects the experience, regardless of skill level. Halo 4's multiplayer is a component that's as flawed as it is visceral. Its speed, great controls, and satisfying weapons make it one of the most technically proficient Halo games developed. But its design seems to be at odds with itself, creating loadouts, despite Halo's sandbox not having enough weapons to result in a compelling loadout system. Aiming for accessibility above all else, while making it easier than ever for experienced players to crush those just starting. Emphasizing large maps that only appear in 2 playlists. I believe it's not just a symptom of it being 343's first project, but with many multiplayer developers having such different backgrounds from Bungie, stemming from studios such as Epic, Pandemic, Retro, and both SOCOM teams, Zipper Interactive, and Slant 6. I can respect the notion of not wanting Halo 4's multiplayer to feel identical to any of the previous games, but it seems that they weren't able to nail down what they were aiming for. There's nothing particularly broken in Halo 4 multiplayer, there's just many pieces that don't mesh, and due to drastic post-launch support and removing many of the additions in Master Chief Collection, it says that 343 became very aware of their mistakes. A heavy blow against Halo 4's multiplayer was its community features, or lack thereof on launch. While Forge may have been available on day one, global file sharing didn't exist properly until early 2013, by which point, due to imbalanced weapons and repetitive playlists, the progression system and unlocks weren't enough to keep players coming back. And while certain Affinity's take on Forge wasn't bad and had more visual variety, the small layouts weren't enough to satisfy players' creativity, and the bizarre removal of certain features from Reach made for a map editor that regressed instead of progressed. Forge Island eventually came out, but once again, it was too little, too late. Halo 4's multiplayer has a satisfying speed and impact that had been missing in the last few games, and its maps are genuinely well designed that allow for Halo's sandbox to produce the awesome moments it's known for. Unfortunately, it's got plenty of rough edges, and while I may be able to deal with them, many of the elements surrounding Halo 4's core gameplay are misguided and don't add to the experience. Despite 343 Industries being a whole new studio, they only carried the last game's issue: a lack of focus. Every Halo game I've covered has taken a few steps forward and a few steps back. Halo Combat Evolved laid the foundation. It modernized a whole genre for consoles, with gameplay and input that's great to this day, but it suffered from a rushed development, leading to repetitive levels. Halo 2 built off of Halo 1 with new features that were natural additions to the sandbox, and revolutionized online multiplayer, but its campaign was more linear and scripted due to, yet again, a troubled development cycle. Halo 3 assembled the best from both games into a finely tuned package, both in campaign and multiplayer, as well as launch community features that would be embraced for years. But its multiplayer map design began to stagnate, and its new gameplay features didn't contribute to the sandbox in an interesting way. Halo 3 ODST made for the most out of a hectic situation, giving Halo a new atmosphere that resonates in today's gaming market, with arguably one of the best campaigns in the series. But its storytelling fell to its ambition, and was launched as a greedy cash grab instead of a generous expansion. Halo Reach aimed for the stars and fell underneath its own weight. Customization, Forge, and community features were expanded to make for a shooter that was unmatched in terms of great user content and flexibility, but the content by Bungie themselves lacked that seal of quality previously found. To arrive at the present, Halo 4 injected greatly improved storytelling, the most polished scene in the franchise, and the most satisfying weapons. But while Halo's new studio accomplished a lot with their first game, elements of its core suffered to the demand of fidelity, and despite being a new studio, many of its issues were carried over from Bungie games released over a decade ago. Halo's a franchise that has never truly peaked, with Halo 3 coming the closest to satisfying everyone, but not quite. Halo 4 was an opportunity to bring the series back to its core foundation, and it sort of is in certain aspects, mainly in the campaign's mystery and wonder of its setting, and bringing back the speed and punch of the earlier games. But as with Reach, it tries to satisfy everyone and stumbles in trying to do so. What specialties from each game stands out the most is a greatly subjective topic. But objectively, Halo 4 is a solid game with its hectic combat, great control, and technical prowess, and left the series to tackle new ideas in a new age. Hopefully. Thank you so much for watching, and if you've been here since the beginning, then you'll know that this is the end. No, everyone's already broken down Halo 5. Halo 5 wasn't even out when I started this series, it's why I never listed it in the intro. You guys are so cruel.